The lonely monster betrayed by his own toilet, the killer taking a road trip with the weirdest passenger ever, and the hardcore psychopath who was done in by a floppy disk. Today we're proving that the so-called criminal genius is nothing more than a movie myth. These are the 10 dumbest mistakes that got serial killers caught. Number 10. Earl Leonard Nilsen operated between 1926 and 1927, slaying between 22 and 29 people. He also collected a series of insane nicknames in the process: the Dark Strangler, the Gorilla Killer, and the Gorilla Man. Earl is actually considered the first serial sex murderer of the 20th century, and he certainly made his mark with exceptionally brutal treatment toward his victims, both before and after their deaths. Some of the bodies of the victims were so messed up that investigators at the time compared them to the murders of the one and only Jack the Ripper. His crimes were so brutal, they even inspired Alfred Hitchcock to make his movie Shadow of a Doubt. But despite being such a scary guy, Earl went down in a spectacularly dumb fashion. Earl's last victim, Emily Patterson, put up a real fight before Earl bludgeoned her to death with a hammer. She scratched at his head as he overpowered her, even pulling out some tufts of hair. Earl, being weirdly vain for someone they called the Gorilla Man, went to a local barber for a shave and a haircut afterward. The barber, Nicholas Tabor, noticed the blood in Earl's hair and the vicious scratches on his scalp. When he brought it up, Earl got agitated, demanded he not touch the wounds, and left. The humble barber would soon be one of the key witnesses pointing the police in Earl's direction, which put him on a direct collision course with the hangman's noose. But at least he died with a fresh new cut. Earl's defeat is definitely humiliating, but not quite as humiliating as getting absolutely clapped by one of your victims, though. Number 9. Jeffrey Dahmer is so infamous that he practically needs no introduction. The Milwaukee cannibal is almost inescapable in true crime circles, brutalizing a string of victims to satisfy his perverse fantasies. Dahmer had already gotten away with some insanely lucky breaks as killers go, even having a victim returned to him by the authorities after he was able to convince them that the escaped teenager was just his boyfriend acting out. Perhaps it was the hubris from incidents like this that drove him when he picked up his last victim, Tracy Edwards, and lured him back to his apartment with a promise that they would drink beer and keep him company. Of course, Dahmer changed his tune when they actually got there, handcuffing Edwards and saying that he was going to eat his heart. Somehow, Edwards kept his cool and just talked to Dahmer, convincing him that he was totally okay with whatever freaky murderous games the lonely weirdo wanted to try out on him, so long as they could knock back a few beers and take a bathroom break. Dahmer, perhaps seduced by the fact that he always wanted a victim to so willingly submit to his desires, obliged Edwards in his request. This gave him enough time to find an opening, at which point he gave Dahmer an almighty smack and ran out of there. He told the cops, and they arrested Dahmer at last, finding the remains of 17 men inside of the killer's apartment. He'd later be beaten to death with a barbell by one of his cellmates. In a bizarre late-game epilogue to the story, Tracy Edwards was clearly forever changed by his experience, narrowly surviving Milwaukee's most infamous killer. In 2011, he was also charged with murder after throwing a man off of a bridge. Edwards' attorney said of his client, "It's like Humpty Dumpty. It's like he was never able to put the pieces back together again." Admittedly, a bit of a poorly chosen metaphor after your client caused a man to fall to his death, but getting screwed because you trusted your victim is one thing. What about deciding to misplace trust in a friend? Number 8. You've probably never heard of Charles Schmid, but he was known as the Pied Piper of Tucson, an Arizona serial killer who loved luring women into his car in order to brutalize and kill them in the worst ways imaginable. And on top of that, he was just plain weird. Schmid seemed to be angry at women because he was a little on the shorter side, 5 foot 3 inches specifically. But this was no short king, he was a straight-up short villain. He wore ridiculously huge cowboy boots stuffed with rags to compensate for his lack of height. He was also known to be a pathological liar, telling women that he was terminally ill and he had mafia connections. And before he began his killing spree, he said to his buddies, quote, "I want to kill a girl, I want to do it tonight. I think I can get away with it." But his tendency to openly yell about the crimes he loved committing was completely unsurprisingly what brought his crime spree to an abrupt end. He twisted the arm of his buddy Richard Burns into helping him bury the bodies of some of his victims. He also bragged about his killings to anybody who would listen. Most didn't believe him. However, in the end, Burns turned his friend in, fearing that eventually Schmid would kill his girlfriend in a fit of Napoleon complex rage. Charles Schmid must have just been as terrible to hang out with in prison too, because a pair of other inmates stabbed him 47 times, killing him in 1975. But even Schmid seemed downright subtle compared to the blunder that got our next killer cooked. Number 7. The Berlin-based serial killer Peter Gobbles had no relation to the other famous Gobbles, but they are of similar moral fiber. He was a sex offender who covered up after his crimes by strangling his victims in the aftermath. He was so intent on not being caught for his horrific actions that he was even willing to kill. The 23-year-old budding serial killer seemingly couldn't control his urges, and soon enough, those urges had a body count of 4 innocent women. It seemed like nothing could stop his rampage. He might even go on to become one of Germany's most prolific serial killers, until his 4th murder, where he made one of the most idiotic blunders a sadistic criminal possibly could. He dropped his ID at the crime scene. That's basically the most incriminating thing you could do, short of taking a selfie with your murder victim and posting it to Instagram with the caption, "New murder just dropped, hashtag I really killed her, hashtag serial killer." After he was caught, he tried to deny responsibility, claiming that he did what he did because he was a sick man. That didn't stop the German authorities from giving him a life sentence for his crimes. While Gobbles' mistake might have been pretty brain-dead, it's still not nearly as farcical as the way our next serial killer ended his own reign of terror. Number 6. Dennis Nilsen was a lonely guy, and because nobody had invented Grindr back in the 70s and 80s, he decided he was better off satisfying his desire for companionship with cold-blooded murder. The British multiple murderer had a very consistent modus operandi. He befriended the men and boys in nearby pubs before bringing them back to his apartment. There, he would strangle them to death and sit with their corpses on his couch to feel a sense of closeness. And you thought the dating scene these days was rough. All of this would make Dennis enough of a sick puppy on its own, but he got real creative and real gross when it came to body disposal. He'd keep the bodies around under the floorboards just so he could have some fun before they got too decomposed, which he recorded in detail in written journals. When they were too moldy to have his way with, he dismembered them, sometimes boiling the flesh off of their bones so he could flush the excess down the toilet. And that was when the toilets got clogged. A plumber from a company hilariously named Dino Rod was called in to ease the blockage, which he immediately recognized seemed a lot more like human flesh. Dennis, ever the smooth talker, gave an alternate suggestion. "It looks to me like someone's been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken." Great save, Dennis. Except no, obviously it wasn't. The plumbers called the cops, who arrived at the apartment building not long after. When the other tenants pointed them to the weird loner on the top floor, they went to have a chat with him and they found that his flat smelled remarkably like decomposing human flesh. When they told him that the blockage in the pipes was conclusively proven to be human, he pretended to be shocked, saying, "Good grief, how awful." The detectives were having none of it, and one of them said, "Don't mess about, where's the rest of the body?" And Dennis immediately caved and confessed to the murder and 12 or 13 others. And somehow he is much less of an edgelord than our next killer. Number 5. Israel Keyes. The more a killer seems to think that they're some Dexter-style smooth operator, the dumber and sloppier their end will prove to be. And that was the case for criminal Renaissance man Israel Keyes. He dabbed in serial murder, arson, kidnapping for ransom, and even bank robbery. Is there anything that this guy couldn't do? As it turns out, avoid detection. Keyes was a real nasty guy. He'd obsessed over and studied serial killers from a young age to perfect his technique. And the crime that got him put away was the kidnapping, assault, and murder of a woman named Sam Koenig. This case is particularly infamous for the ransom letters that he sent to Koenig's parents, where he put makeup on her corpse and held her eyes open with fishing line to make it seem like she was still alive for ransom pictures. For a self-styled criminal genius, he was pretty stupid when it came to clearing his tracks. He continued to use Koenig's credit card at ATMs, where he was recorded multiple times on security footage with his rental car in the background. It made it extremely easy to track his movements. His paranoia also seemed to get to him because he drove erratically, and when he was pulled over by police, they found that he was carrying large wads of cash in the car, all stained with bright dye because he'd robbed them from a bank. He was arrested after that and gave a lengthy, self-aggrandizing confession that has since become the obsession of weird serial killer groupies for years. He decided to become his own last victim before his case ever went to trial. But our next killer has Israel massively beat in 2 ways: the extent of his crimes and the stupidness of the reason he got caught. Number 4. Randy Kraft murdered so many people that he was actually thought to be 3 entirely separate killers: the scorecard killer, the Southern California Strangler, and the Freeway Killer. He murdered anywhere from 16 to 67 people. He treated murder like a sport, taking pleasure in each kill and recording them on a coded scorecard. On the outside, Randy seemed to have it all together. He was a successful computer programmer, which was a way bigger deal in the 80s than it is now. But when he wasn't working with strings of complex code, he was strangling young men to death to get his sick kicks. Many of his victims showed signs of mutilation and torture while they were still alive, and Randy took photos so he could relive the memory later. Everything about him suggests that he was the kind of careful, meticulous serial killer that we're used to seeing in big-budget thrillers, successful keeping a double life while keeping the more criminal parts of himself suppressed in the day-to-day. Well, except when he got loaded and decided to take a joyride. That's right, Randy Kraft wasn't actually caught for murder. He was caught for drunk driving. Police saw him weaving erratically across the roads and pulled him over, then noticed that there was someone in the passenger seat. That someone turned out to be one of Randy's victims already dead. This monumental oversight and planning saw this career strangler get strangled by the long arm of the law. Strangely, unlike a lot of killers who tend to parade their notoriety around after getting caught, Kraft has professed his innocence to this day. Our next killer actually has an even more brutal body count than Kraft, and somehow a capture that was even more hilariously avoidable. Number 3. Dr. Harold Shipman is considered to be one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. He was a British medic with at least 250 confirmed kills, killing over a span of 30 years between 1975 and 1998. His crimes were so insanely widespread that the UK government launched the Shipman Inquiry, a study into his crimes chaired by the Right Honourable Lady Justice Smith. Yes, that is her full title. England is weird. The motive behind Shipman's crimes was apparently a pure lust for power over other human beings. He was a cruel and domineering husband and father to his family, and getting to end the lives of elderly patients with controlled drug overdoses made him feel an almost godlike sense of power. But it's ironic that it wasn't his lust for power that proved to be the end of Shipman's killing spree, but the one time he decided to switch his motive up to plain old boring greed. People had suspected Shipman for a while. Patients had died mysteriously under his care, but he always had the bodies cremated, so it was difficult to get prosecutable evidence. Even a local taxi driver named John Shaw suspected him of a series of murders. He had taken 21 old ladies on rides to the hospital, seemingly lively and healthy, who died not long after in Shipman's care. But the straw that broke the camel's back was the death of Kathleen Grundy, a wealthy former mayor. And wouldn't you know it, she seemingly made a last-minute decision to alter her will, leaving out her children and grandchildren and instead giving £386,000 to her beloved doctor. It all came crumbling down after that. Shipman was arrested and decided to wrap things up by giving himself a taste of his own lethal medicine in his cell. But Shipman and his act of absurdly wanton greed still seem downright restrained compared to Number 2. Robert Durst made waves as the subject of the hit 2015 documentary series The Jinx. It revealed the strange facts of the wealthy heir's life and the many crimes that he'd been suspected of. For anyone who doesn't know, we'll just say that the worst of his crimes involved murder and dismemberment. It always seemed like he'd be able to get away with it and live off the $65 million he'd been awarded in inheritance. That was until he agreed to be on the documentary, filmed between 2010 and 2012. Because Durst had all the subtlety of a car bomb, he was filmed in an awkward hot mic moment, mumbling to himself saying, "What the hell did I do? I killed them all, of course." If that wasn't stupid enough, the documentary got the police interested in him again, which made being on it a bizarre choice when he was still actively committing crimes. When the cops checked in on him, they found him wandering around with a loaded gun, which was illegal considering he was a convicted felon. And convicted felons aren't supposed to own guns, loaded or otherwise. He was sentenced to 85 months in jail for the gun charge. In October 2021, Durst was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for the murder of Susan Berman, but died just 3 months later. Speaking of guys who could have gotten away with their horrible crimes if only they had known how to shut up, there is one more killer we just have to include. Number 1. In many ways, it seemed like Dennis Rader was grown in a lab to be a Hollywood-ready murderous monster. He developed violent fantasies from a young age and seemed to live his life with the aim of training himself to be the perfect killing machine. His time in the military gave him the physical edge over his victims. His studies of criminal justice in college made him aware of the law that would be after him. And his work as a security system installation expert gave him the knowledge to break into homes where he would tie women up and asphyxiate them to death. When not committing murders, he held down the image of a perfect family man, even leading his son's Boy Scout troop. Dennis also had a twisted cosplay habit. In his free time, he dressed himself up in items of clothing taken from his victims and took twisted murder selfies while tying himself up and wearing grotesque masks. And he was cocky too. He left notes at his crime scene saying things like, "The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK." And after a few murders, sent a letter to a local TV station saying, "How many people do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national attention?" He taunted police, and when he seemed to stop killing in 1991, it seemed like he had disappeared. Until his ego and his crippling lack of tech skills got the better of him in 2004. Bored by the lack of attention, he started sending cereal boxes to the police, full of evidence, taunting letters, drawings, and even dolls posed to look like his crime scenes. In 2005, hoping to update his law enforcement taunting for the digital age, he asked his police pen pals whether they could trace him if he sent them a floppy disk. Sensing an opportunity truly too good to be true, the cops posted a classified ad saying that no, there was no way they could trace a floppy disk, and Dennis was so high off his own supply that inexplicably he actually believed them. He sent in the floppy disk containing his writings. Police found the metadata in a deleted Word document, and it got immediately traced back to Rader, landing him in jail, where he still sits at 80 years old over 2 decades later. Some serial killers were brought down by their own stupidity, but others slipped through the cracks completely. Watch Worst Serial Killers That Cops Never Caught to learn about the ones who vanished without a trace, or click on this video instead.